On this special episode of Movie Geeks United, we welcome back our returning guest, the great author Ray Morton. Ray has joined us many times on the show to talk about the production of many films that have resonated with popular American culture in various ways, and he's written many terrific books about the production of films that we all know, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, A Hard Day's Night, and the King Kong series of films. Anyway, we're here today to talk about the production of Superman 3. He was previously on the show to talk about Superman 2 a couple of years ago. I believe 3 years ago, we talked about Superman 2. And so it would only be logical that we would pick up with Superman 3 when it was time for a 40th anniversary, which we are doing today.
Absolutely,
so,
yes.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. Superman 2, of course, was released in December of 1980 everywhere but the United States, and it was released here in the summer of 1981. We like to think of it as a 1981 film, but it's really technically a 1980 film. So by the time Superman 3 hit screens in, I guess that was June of 83, it was a much anticipated film. And with Richard Lester taking over the production of Superman 2 due to several disagreements with the Salkinds that Richard Donner had, and he actually was interested in doing at least 2 more Superman films, and when he was taken out of Superman 2, that kind of put an end to that. So we'll pick it up with what was going on at that point, what they were going to do next. They obviously had a hit on their hands with Superman 2, and usually, as it is in the movie business, if you've got you want to strike while the iron is hot, and that's
Absolutely.
what they wanted to do. So I'll let you tell us a little bit about how the ball got rolling on Superman 3.
Well, when the Salkinds originally purchased the rights to Superman, they originally had in mind the idea of doing an entire series of films. They had the idea of that it would be like a Bond series, so there'd be a new one every couple of years, and that it would go on and on and on. But Superman 1 and Superman 2 turned out to be such gargantuan projects and difficult projects to pull off that I think their ambitions ended up getting a bit scaled back. In the aftermath of Superman 2, Ilya Salkind, who was the executive producer of the projects, he came up with an idea. He was a big fan of the comic book material, not just the character of Superman, but all of the different issues. And he grew up in the 50s, and so that was the era of sort of high fantasy Superman and the Superman family, as they used to call it. So all the other super characters, Supergirl and Superwoman and Krypto the Superdog and so on. So his idea for the third film initially was he wanted to do a sort of a fantasy spectacular. And so he had come up with a script in which Superman battles Mr. Mxyzptlk, who's the little elf from another dimension or sprite from another dimension who causes all sorts of problems. And into this story of battling Mxyzptlk, who they wanted Dudley Moore to play, because he's a man of short stature, and so was Dudley Moore, obviously. He would come in contact with Supergirl, although it was kind of a different version of Supergirl, because in the comics, Supergirl is Superman's cousin. But in this script, Superman and Supergirl were going to get together and maybe even get married. So obviously it was a different sort of version of the character. And Brainiac was going to be in it. And so there was sort of it was jumping around in time. There was segments set in medieval time and segments set on other planets. So it was a kind of a giant in scope fantasy epic. And he presented that the production of the Superman films were very, the structure was kind of odd. They were independent films. The Salkinds had purchased the rights from originally DC Comics, National Periodical Publications, but in the midst of all those negotiating, National Periodical was bought by Warner Brothers or Warner Communications. So they were kind of involved with Warner Brothers, and that's how the deal came to release the films through Warner Brothers. And in the making of Superman, Warner Brothers ended up taking part ownership of the films, which the Salkinds did not care for. But the point being, Warner Brothers was now kind of involved in the films. They had some approvals because the first two films were financed independently. Alexander Salkind went around to all sorts of different groups of investors and put the money together. And that's how they financed those films. But they got into so much trouble and ended up having to sell a bunch of it to Warner Brothers. So when it came time to do Superman 3, they didn't do any of that. They basically, Warner's basically financed the film. It was still an independent production, but they were the people who loaned them the money. The point of it being that Warner's had more input into this than they did in the genesis of the first two films. And anyway, Ilya Salkind presented his story concepts to Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers didn't like it because they felt, first of all, it was going to be way too expensive, but also they felt it was so fantasy oriented. You know, the great thing about the first two Superman films was Richard Donner's concept of verisimilitude, which is to establish a reality from which the fantasy could jump off from, because cinema, no matter what you do with it, no matter how fantastic you get, is basically a realistic medium in that you're photographing real people, usually in real environments, although not so much in our CG era. And Warner's just felt like there was no reality to the script that audiences could grab onto, so they just didn't want to do that. So they asked the Salkinds to come up with a simpler idea. And one of the core ideas in Ilya's treatment was that Superman would be turned into a villain at some point, basically turn against himself. Like he would become bad and then at some point split into two and fight himself. So they kind of started over using that idea as the core. The original title of the screenplay was not Superman 3. It was Superman versus Superman. And so that became the jumping off point. The other key jumping off point was that famously Richard Pryor had appeared on the Johnny Carson show, The Tonight Show, and he was a big Superman fan, and I guess at the time he appeared, he had just seen Superman 2, and he was very enthusiastic, and he basically acted out huge pieces of the movie on the Tonight Show, and yeah, obviously put a comic spin on it and all, but he was so enthusiastic that Ilya and Pierre Spengler, the producer, they had seen this and thought, and Richard Pryor at the time was a big movie star, so the idea was, let's see if we could get Richard Pryor into the Superman film. So that was the other jumping off point. And then the final jumping off point was that was the era when computers were just starting to become a big deal in our lives. So they also wanted to do something with computers. So those three ideas were kind of thrown into the hopper. All of the fantasy stuff was rejected. And then they brought in David Newman and Leslie Newman, who had written some of the drafts of Superman 1 and had written the final shooting script for Superman 2 after Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz left. So because Superman 2 was a hit, they invited the Newmans back. And Warner Brothers also invited Richard Lester back. He initially declined, but they offered him more money than any director had been offered in history to come back. So as the story goes, his wife said, "What are you, out of your mind? Of course you're going to do it." And so the Salkinds and the Newmans and Lester basically brainstormed what became Superman 3.
There's a lot of other things here that are kind of interesting to note. I think because they were originally going to title it Superman versus Superman, and then it was retitled after the producers of Kramer versus Kramer threatened a lawsuit of all things.
Right. I've read that. I'm not sure.
I don't know if it's true or not.
That is, but sure, that sounds good.
Yeah, and we always have to, this is just research that I've done. I can't say with 100% certainty that these things actually happen, but these are just some interesting things that I've come across, that there was actually in the original, the climax of the original film would have seen Superman, Supergirl, Brainiac, Jimmy Olsen, and Lana Lang time traveling to the Middle Ages for a final confrontation in fiefdom taken over by Brainiac. And then he defeats...
Yeah, it was a little complicated.
Right, yeah, it's a little bit out there. And then he defeated Superman and left him behind as a helpless serf, supposedly. And then Superman and Supergirl being married at the end of either Superman 3 or 4. I don't know. This is kind of crazy. But, yeah, so... And then they actually, I think... considered selling it to Dino De Laurentiis, the rights, because of the he had more financial backing, and so they thought about that for a while. Supposedly, I don't know. Yeah,
they had taken their original option when they made their contract. I believe it was for 25 years, and so they had the rights to make these movies for 25 years, and famously. I hesitate to say they got in over their heads on Superman. I think ultimately they did. But part of the thing is that was the beginning of the special effects, science fiction, fantasy movie modern era. And I think no one knew how much a Superman movie was going to cost. So they did get in over their heads, but not necessarily because, they didn't know what they were doing, but more because no one knew how much these kind of movies cost then. But the point is they were like Dino De Laurentiis in that time, independent producers. They like to raise the money from various the idea was you would pre-sell the rights to a film of various territories across the world and use that money to make the movie. They ran into a lot of financial trouble on Superman 1. They basically didn't have enough money to finish it, which is why they famously did not complete Superman 2 at the time. And Warner Brothers ended up coming in and purchasing huge pieces of the film. They got distribution rights from many territories, and the Salkinds they basically lost the ownership of that first film. They kept the ownership of the second film, but they took them until the release, they said, of Superman 3 to even begin to break even on the whole project. So by the time they were getting ready to do Superman 3, I think they had soured on the idea that they were going to do 10 films. And I know they did look around for buyers. Dino was one of the people they considered. They ultimately sold the rights after Supergirl or they leased the rights to Canon, of all people. I think we would have been happier if Dino had taken it over, but it ended up with Canon at a certain point.
It became cannon fodder.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, sadly. It's amazing that these films, they started out so strongly, and in less than 10 years, this whole franchise, as it was being controlled by the Salkinds, had completely imploded. That's kind of mind-boggling.
The thing that's interesting, it shows you, I think, the importance of casting the behind-the-scenes talent as well as the in-front-of-the-camera talent. And I think the Superman series, in general, was poorly cast behind the scenes. Richard Donner was the perfect director for those films, and Tom Mankiewicz was the perfect writer for those films. And they both were gone after the success of Superman 1 because of various issues between Donner and the Salkinds that I know we've talked about in other podcasts. But the interesting thing, if you've ever read the origin of Superman the movie was that Mario Puzo wrote the initial drafts of both Superman 1 and Superman 2. And if you read them, which I have read them, they basically only contain some of the basic ideas that ended up, like the plotting and all of that. None of it was in Mario Puzo's script. So Robert Benton, David Newman, and Leslie Newman came in, and they really wrote the early drafts of what eventually became Superman the movie. But if you read those scripts, they're kind of fascinating because not every scene, but basically every scene in Superman 1 and Superman 2 is in their drafts. But also there's a ton of other things in the drafts, and they're just kind of, I don't know, loosely plotted. They're very episodic. The story doesn't build to anything in both their Superman 1 and their original Superman 2 screenplays. So it's just kind of random, and they clearly did the project with their tongue in cheek. Like they're jokey, and they don't take the character particularly seriously. I don't know if they're as incredibly campy as the reputation has, but they clearly don't take the world of Superman seriously. They always go for jokes. So you have these kind of light, jokey, not very well structured stories. Tom Mankiewicz came in with Richard Donner, and one of the things they did is they imposed a structural discipline on the stories. They basically created story arcs for both films and really pulled them together and focused them. And as much as they could, the Donner Superman first one and his portions of Superman 2, they are not deadly serious films, but they take the character of Superman and his world seriously, and they have fun with it rather than making fun of it. And the problem is for me with the Benton and Newman drafts is they kind of made fun of it, which I don't really think is a great approach. And when Donner and Mankiewicz left, the Newmans came back and kind of went back to the same tone. Superman 2 works as well as it does, I think, because it still has Mankiewicz's structure, but it definitely has a lighter tone to it. And then when they came to Superman 3, they kind of wrote the same kind of script, episodic, kind of unfocused and rambling, and very light and comedic and jokey. And I think Superman 3 is the movie Superman 1 would have been if Donner and Mankiewicz hadn't come in, because the scripts are very similar in their approach to the character and the story. And of course, Richard Lester, who he gets a lot of brickbats from Superman fans, some of whom I've read, when I read their comments, I'm like, you guys do not know your film history. Because, Richard Lester was terrible in all of this. Richard Lester is a brilliant filmmaker. He just wasn't a guy suited to do Superman. And so he took it all. He's known for his comedy. So he approached everything with a comedic touch. And so the Newman's lightness, Lester's emphasis on comedy, and then just kind of a loose, unstructured story, you end up with a movie that kind of just is there. It doesn't really have any of the epic structure and excitement and build that the first two films have. So I think it's a casting problem, if you will.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a problem with the structure of the story. You're exactly right. And yeah, there were some really, I've read parts of that original draft, and I just remember the scene that always sticks out in my mind from Superman, the original, one of those original drafts you were referring to, is the one where the camera just comes out of the air and pans way down, and there's Kojak, and all of a sudden pulls out a lollipop and says, "Who loves you, baby?" or something like that.
The line that always strikes me in Superman 3, which to me typifies what I'm talking about, is there's a scene where Lana Lang is talking to Clark Kent, and she's talking about how exciting life must be in Metropolis, which of course we know is kind of a version of New York. And New York's nickname is the Big Apple. And so she goes, "You're from Metropolis, the Big Apricot." And I'm thinking, like, that's a dumb sitcom line. It's like so jokey, and that's in there to be a joke as opposed to any kind of verisimilitude. And I feel like that's the problem with the whole movie, is that it just, when it could take it seriously, it goes for a joke. And it took all there's no epic quality to Superman 3, whereas there's a wonderful epic quality to 1 and 2. Even the central idea of Superman 3 is wonderful. Superman turns evil and eventually splits in two and fights himself. That's a great idea for a movie. But when they have him turn evil, the things he does is he straightens the Tower of Pisa and he blows out the Olympic flame, as opposed to, Superman really causing some mayhem. Like, what would happen if Superman turned evil and wanted to take over the world? Like, there was an epic idea there, and they went for jokes. They went and not good jokes, like silliness rather. And maybe that's it, silliness rather than wit or humor. Like, Superman 1 has its jokes and its humor, but mostly it's witty or clever. This is just kind of dumb. And so you take this great idea for a Superman movie and you just don't do anything with it. And instead you focus on a bunch of silly villains and all that kind of stuff. It's just a squandered opportunity, I think.
Yeah. And David Newman is a good writer. I mean, I would like to point that out. I mean, he had, obviously been involved with some very noteworthy films. And one of my favorites, What's Up, Doc?
Yes,
he's a co-writer on that. So he was great at the comedy stuff. That's a great example of what he's good at. But when he's an action film, not so much.
Yeah. Well, it's the thing about, I mean, now that we're so inundated with superhero movies, it's hard to remember all of this. But there was, in that era, with the success of Star Wars and the success of Superman, obviously there were lots of imitators, but you had all these sort of established, all those movies were really made by young filmmakers or filmmakers, on the cusp. And when they started to do these other things, all the filmmakers were maybe established and they couldn't take it seriously. And they wanted to sort of let you, the audience, know that they knew this was kind of silly stuff. And that's why you see a lot of movies with a lot of campiness and a lot of jokiness, as opposed to taking the characters seriously in their own world, which is what Richard Donner did so well in the first Superman movie. And I think Newman was a very good writer. He and Benton, of course, wrote, many terrific films, Bonnie and Clyde, What's Up, Doc, and so on. Yeah. But I think he was also a very smart man. And the thing is, I think they just couldn't quite, they had to let you know they knew this was kind of silly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that it doesn't work when you do, it turns to paste when you do that,
Yeah, we could definitely do without Superman at the bar eating, flicking peanuts with his.
Right. Well, of all the things he could do, like that seems like a waste of the opportunity.
Right.
Yeah, and the other opportunity, they also talk about the world's most dangerous computer by, this computer genius, Richard Pryor. But they don't do anything with that either. It's kind of, they come up with this really cool set in the end and he fights against, whatever he's fighting against, but you can't really tell. But it's like the tongue was too much in cheek, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, let's talk a little bit about that slapstick ballet that opens the film. That's just a little... I think it's kind of funny. I mean, it makes me, it's typical of Richard Lester type stuff, but it just doesn't feel like it belongs in a Superman movie. That's the problem. It's so tonally inconsistent with everything we've come to know about the Superman films. And that, I was immediately, even seeing it, I think I was on the cusp of turning 13 years old at that point where it came out. And I just remember seeing it and thinking it was, I chuckled and I laughed in that way you would at that age. But I thought, this just doesn't feel like a Superman movie.
Well, the original idea of it was kind of clever. The idea was supposed to be that one little thing goes wrong and it leads to a chain reactions of thing going wrong until it results in this big disaster, and then Superman would come in and save the day. The problem in the writing and the final execution of it, all the little things that are going wrong do not lead to the thing that leads to Superman coming to save the day, which kind of happens separately from the little slapstick ballet. Mm-hmm. So I think if they had stayed with the original idea, it still might have been too funny, but you would have said, okay, this is the kind of situation that calls for Superman. But instead, it's just kind of there, and you don't really understand why it's there. And some of it's amusing, but Richard Lester, in his best films, there's a sharp satirical sense to his work. This is very just light, silly slapstick stuff, and it's stuff we had seen before, so it didn't have much teeth to it. And the other big change in the film is that the original Superman and Superman 2 parts of it were filmed in New York City. And this was filmed in Calgary, in Canada, Alberta in Canada. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, that just doesn't look like New York City. It looks like a kind of a nice, quiet, suburban kind of city kind of thing. It doesn't have the epic sense of Metropolis the way that that the original films did. So it kind of looks a little lazy and cheap too, on top of the fact that the slapstick tonally doesn't really work. And so it starts to feel a little cheap and a little kind of shoddy around the edges.
Yeah, some of those effects they're not bad per se, but they're borderline they're questionable. Let's just put it that way. So,
yeah. And even the first rescue is a guy, his car gets stuck on a fire hydrant and the car fills up with water, and Superman, flies in and pulls the roof off the car, except he clearly pulls a pre-scored roof off the car. So it doesn't look that amazing. And it's kind of a silly thing. Like, that would not happen in real life. Therefore, does that really require, people couldn't just open the door and let the guy out, or he couldn't, it wasn't a big epic save like you want Superman to do. It was light and it was silly. And that's, that's again, the ongoing issue with that film.
Yeah. It would have been much more interesting to have the onlookers rescue the man just as Superman arrives, and then he's like, "Oh well, I just wasted my time."
There you go.
Made him put a little egg on his face or whatever. That would have been a better way to do it. Oh well, what could have been? Yeah, and then there's that sequence that appears not long after that where he freezes the lake and flies along with the frozen lake, and that's a little. I remember seeing that and thinking, I don't know.
Yeah, it has the same problem, which is it's maybe on paper not a bad idea, but it's all just very like Richard Lester, as good a director as he is, he's not an action director. I don't think it's because he's not talented at action, because if you ever see a movie like Juggernaut, he's terrific at it.
Oh, absolutely.
But I don't think he was particularly interested in the action, so that whole sequence has kind of a casual feel to it. Like, you never. The entire film, you never get a sense of a ticking clock or high stakes. And that sequence does not have a ticking clock or high stakes. It has a little bit of a ticking clock with, they don't want to heat up the acid, but it's not enough to register. And so it's, there's a couple of interesting bits in it, but it never really gels into, wow, that was an exciting sequence. And I really think that's kind of true throughout the film,
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on. You're exactly right. And it's funny, you were mentioning his choice. Well, I don't know if it was his choice, but the fact that the production was shot in Calgary, Alberta, a lot of it. It is, just as a curio, I like to mention that Richard Lester was returning to the scene of previous crimes, as it were, because this was where he had shot Help at Battersea Power Station. There's a sequence where he leaves Gus in a coal mine, and that was actually Help previously. So,
well, that was actually that was a famous location. They used it for Your Eyes Only, the opening sequence where Bond is flying the helicopter through the abandoned path. That was a hot location there for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So But a lot of it was filmed around London. The exteriors were filmed mostly in Canada, and then the interiors and some of the exterior stuff was done in England. Like, none of it was done in the States, except maybe some second unit stuff.
Yeah, and it definitely feels that way too. It really does have that feel, like you said. We'll talk a little bit about the casting here. It's a little controversy. Because Gene Hackman and Margot Kidder it's always been said that they were angry with the way that the Salkinds treated Richard Donner, and they were going to stand with Donner and not really participate in Superman 3 or very little. I mean, Margot Kidder returns as Lois Lane, but, with what happened at the end of Superman 2, I felt there was such promise on what happened there that they could follow through on that, and there was a lot of possibilities, shall we say, with that plot line that was just completely ignored, which I thought was really odd.
Yes.
And they say that maybe the Salkinds reportedly punished her by reducing her role in Superman 3, but then Hackman later denied those claims, and he said that he was just busy with other commitments, and that if he kept returning as Lex Luthor, it would be like a horror film sequel where the serial killer keeps coming back from the grave. And then the Salkinds denied that they cut Margot Kidder's part in retaliation. So there's a lot of he said, she said going on there.
Yeah, the reality of it all is I think a little different, because I've heard all those rumors and things. I don't think Hackman was ever going to come back. I don't think he was ever written into the script. He did not come back to do the reshoots on Superman 2, and I've heard various versions of that. Some of it is that he didn't want to come back when Donner was fired. And some of it was he said he didn't have the time. He did show up at all the premieres and things. But the truth is, for the same reason that Marlon Brando was cut out of Superman 2, he had a percentage deal, and the Salkinds didn't want to pay him. And I think Hackman was probably too expensive. The whole reason they got Brando and Hackman in the first place for the first two films was that's how they raise the money. Like, people will finance movies with movie stars in them. So they got these two big movie stars and they put them in the film, and that got the financing. And then when it came time to do Superman 3, Superman was the star. Like, people were going to go to Superman movies, so they didn't need a big star for financing. And Christopher Reeve at that point was a big star, and so was Richard Pryor, who was a big star, but he didn't cost anywhere near what Hackman or Brando cost. So I don't think Hackman was ever included in it. I mean, he's not in the original story treatment. I do think Margot Kidder was in the film. I don't think the Salkinds wanted to employ her, and she's clearly not integral to the story. I think that was a Warner Brothers insistence, that they wanted continuity. They didn't want to just vanish Lois Lane. And so she's in it, but clearly it's just a cameo. I think she shot maybe 2 or 3 days on the film, and I don't know what she was paid, but she was certainly not paid, what she was paid to be in the first couple of films where she had a major part. So yeah, I mean, all of that was kind of, again, it's movie making, right? And it's movie making at a price. The Salkinds were determined to make Superman 3 on budget and not go over, so they could retain all the ownership of it, and they didn't need the big people anymore. And that's just the truth. They needed Christopher Reeve. They didn't really need anybody else at that point.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I just think it's such a missed opportunity with that.
Oh, sure.
With the plot line being so integral to Superman 2, and it's just like, well, that never happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, not. Donner and Mankiewicz had said at different times, and I kind of think it's probably true, is they had said that the Salkinds were never really clear on what they wanted to do with this character, because, again, they were Europeans. The character didn't have the same cultural currency in Europe as it ever did in America. And if you look at some of the early versions, like, some of it is comic and some of it is sort of this weird kind of cosmic stuff. And I think it took Donner and Mankiewicz to figure out what a Superman movie was. Once that template was established, I think the Salkinds were content to go along with it. But I don't know if they ever had like a really strong idea of what they wanted those films to be. So it was kind of left to the people that they brought in, and again, in the Newmans and Lester's case, they were interested in kind of light comedy and silliness, so there it went, and therefore all that epic plot material just went out the window. They just they weren't as interested in it as I think Donner would have been if he had carried on.
Yeah, that's a real shame. Yeah, I remember even being, like I said, seeing it as a teenager, being disappointed that plot line was jettisoned for whatever reasons. But anyway, I mean, it was a big deal. I mean, if Superman is going to give up everything that he is for this person, and to just pretend it never existed or whatever, didn't happen. Yeah. Oh well.
It also sets up an odd thing in Superman 3, which is Superman 2 very much makes the point that Superman cannot have an earthly relationship with a woman.
Yes.
And yet there's a love story in Superman 3. And you're like, well, wait, isn't this going to turn out the same way the thing with Lois turned out? That said, the single best piece of casting in the movie, and I think the most successful piece of that film, is Annette O'Toole as Lana Lang. I think she's wonderful in the part. And I think that's where the real heart of the film lays. And I think Chris Reeve plays with her wonderfully. I don't think it really makes much sense from a story point of view, but to me, it's the best part of the film.
I agree. I love her. She's great. And I've been a fan of hers ever since I saw her in playing Tammy Wynette in a television film in 1981, I think it was. So
yeah.
So this was just a couple of years after that. So I was already familiar with her, and she's real charming in the film. I'm a big fan of her take on that character.
Yeah, and that's where Lester's shown, and even the Newman's shown, because the kind of slightly screwball quality they gave to Lana Lang, that worked. It didn't. I don't really think it worked in the rest of the film, but it did work with her, and she played it wonderfully, and she played it wonderfully with Chris as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, true, very true. Yeah, so the casting, like I said, it was quite interesting with some of the things that were, as we just talked about there, with bringing in new characters, getting rid of old ones. And, of course, Richard Pryor, as we talked about, he had accepted a $5 million salary to appear in this film. And following the release of this film, he signed a 5-year contract with Columbia worth $40 million, or at least that's what it was reported at the time. So That's interesting to note that his career was certainly on an upward trajectory. The effects and animation, supposedly, they credited them, quote unquote, the same special effects team from the prior two films. That was the quote. Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the key people on Superman 1 and 2 were Derek Meddings, who was the brilliant master of miniature shooting, Colin Cheevers, who was a physical effects guy, and then Roy Field, Les Bowie, who were the visual effects guys. Les Bowie had passed away by the time Superman 3 came along, and the other guy was Zoran Perisic, who created the Zoptic system, which was one of the optical systems that they used to help Superman fly. By the time they got to Superman 3, Les Bowie had died. Derek Meddings did not work on the film. Colin Cheevers took over the miniature effects, and they're okay. And I don't think they're as good as Superman 1, but they're okay. There's some good physical effects in it. They did the visual effects, Superman flying, are good. They clearly used the same approaches that were used in Superman 1 and to a lesser extent in Superman 2. The difference, I think, is that Richard Donner would make them do shots over and over and over again until everything was perfect. And that was not the case in Superman 2 with Richard Lester, and I think it's really not the case in Superman 3. There's some very good effects in the film, but there's a lot of effects where you can sort of see the seams showing, and it's just a matter of there's a lot of color mismatching in his costume and things in some of the blue screen shots, which there's like 2 in Superman the movie, and there's probably like 10 or 15 in Superman 3. So I just don't. Again, not necessarily an attack on Richard Lester. I don't think he was that interested in it, and he didn't have the same exacting sense of it that Donner did, and therefore the effects are fine. I don't know that they're as terrific as they could be.
Yeah, but they're certainly better than Superman 4. We'll go on record.
Yes. Well, me playing with a crayon set would be better than Superman 4. Yeah.
Oh yes, those the good old folks at Canon. What more can you say? Yeah. Anyway, so we'll move along. Yeah. So I guess it looks like they started shooting this in June of 1982. As we talked about previously, Pinewood Studios. I tried to find an actual tally of how long it took to shoot the film, but I couldn't find the date in terms of when it finally finished, where it wrapped. So I'm not really sure about.
I think it shot most from June till I believe sometime in the early fall of that year, because again it was a pretty. Not as epic a shoot as Superman the movie, but they moved all over the place. It was a big production, and they had 2 units going, of course, because they had the special effects unit going at the same time that they had the principal photography. So I believe it's shot throughout most of that summer.
Yeah, that sounds about right, I would assume. And of course, there's the normal time that it takes in post-production to get these things done.
Yeah.
Atari, speaking of that sort of thing, they were part of Warner
Yes.
Brothers. They created
Yes.
the video game computer animation for the missile defense scene, which really looks a little. I guess at the time it looked fine, but not so much from.
Actually, no, it didn't look good at the time either.
Okay, I didn't.
I remember
think it
sitting
did,
in the audience. Everybody was groaning, like, "What is this?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, and it looks obviously worse 40 years on. I don't need to elaborate on that, but I just thought that was interesting to mention. Got a little bit of trivia here. One other thing about the casting that I did want to mention was that Christopher Reeve really didn't want to play Superman once again because he was kind of fed up with the role, and he obviously felt Donner had been unfairly treated, as we talked about. And then Tony Danza was considered at one point, supposedly. I don't know how true that was.
I think might be a stretch.
Yeah.
Yeah, only because I know that Reeve had actually already signed on for Superman 3 by the time Superman 2 premiered. So if they considered Tony Danza, it must have been before Superman 2 came out. Although there was Christopher Reeve did hold out when it came time to come back for Superman 2 because famously that production had been suspended, and by the time they were ready to begin reshooting or resuming shooting, I should say, Reeve's contract had actually expired. So he did hold out for more money in renegotiation to do Superman 2. If there was a Tony Danza consideration, that would have been when it was. But he had actually signed up before Superman 2 even came out.
Yeah, that and of course, these are just things we don't really know for sure. But it's just always there. There is I think a deleted scene with Frank Oz where he had a cameo in the film as a surgeon, supposedly later included in the TV extended version.
Which is like all those extended versions, kind of goes on and on and on. But he was in it, and I'm trying to think if there was. I have heard of that one. I don't know who else might have been there on the cutting room floor.
Yeah, I'm not sure either about the. But we can get into the television version here in a second. Mm-hmm. But they say that Richard Pryor, previously had set himself on fire freebasing cocaine, and he was back to his old habits during the production of this film. They say,
yes, I have
out of his
heard that.
brains during filming. So there was that, and the video game that Ross Webster, the villain played by Robert Vaughn,
mm-hmm.
The video game that he was playing in the film was developed especially for the movie, but it had to be downgraded because supposedly the original version was considered too realistic for 1983. So,
I have heard that. I don't have proof of it, but sure, makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I think again, not comedic enough.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I would totally agree. And then I guess we should talk about for sex appeal they brought in Robert Ross Webster's assistant,
his psychic nutritionist.
Psychic nutritionist. Yeah, there we go. That's what it was. I couldn't remember exactly what she was referred to as. She had previously. That's Pamela Stevenson, I believe.
Stevenson, right? Previously from
History of the
not
World.
Necessarily the News.
Right.
And yeah. Actually, a terrific comedic actress, and actually eventually a psychotherapist.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah. So we have a few things in common, she and I.
Indeed, you do. Indeed, you do.
I actually think she's another bright spot in the movie. I don't care for the character. Mm-hmm. I think all too jokey. Yeah. But I think she did a really nice job with it. I actually like Annie Ross, who plays Ross Webster's sister. Yeah. I also think does a very nice job in a part I wish they hadn't written. But and the trivia there is, for those who know, Annie Ross actually provided most of the dialogue dubbing for Sarah Douglas in Superman 2. it's actually Annie Ross's voice that you hear most of the time when you see Ursa on screen in Superman 2.
I don't think I knew that. That's one you
Yeah.
have on me. That's one I somehow missed.
Well, she's a friend of Richard Lester's, as I understand
Yeah.
it. So he used her to revoice Ursa and then brought her in. I think she does a great job. Again, it's not a character that I particularly care for. Though she is responsible for what I understand is, if you are of a certain age, a lot of nightmares for children, because there's the scene in the end where she's turned into a robot by the supercomputer.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't make much of an impression on me, but I was a bit older when it came out. I have younger brothers who tell me that haunted their nightmares for months after seeing it. So okay, there you go.
It didn't really bother me that much either, but I think my sister, who went with me to see it, she was a little disturbed by it, I think, from what I remember.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally. But yeah, and just as a curio, I will mention that there's a scene with a boy at a photo booth, and that's the same actor who played Clark Kent as a child in Superman the movie. So
yes, the one who comes out of the spaceship.
Right. Yep.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Same kid. They brought a few of those folks back. They used much of the same production team from the Lester shoot of Superman 2. So Bob Painter was the director of photography,
Mm-hmm.
And the same production designers. So, and my understanding, it was there aren't a whole lot of stories from the shooting of Superman 3, because from what I understand, it was a pretty smooth shoot. Everyone got along. Lester was known as a fast director, so they didn't go over budget or over schedule. No major cast conflicts or personality problems. So from that point of view, it was a pretty efficient production.
Well, we will talk about, as we get towards the end of everything that was going on, it is interesting to talk about the music. We will talk about that. We talked about that in our last look at Superman 2. The last time we covered this franchise, we talked about the addition of Ken Thorne and the replacement of John Williams, and not really to better effect, I should say.
Well, Ken Thorne was a guy who had a British composer who'd done a lot of smaller English films, and he'd done a lot of work for Richard Lester. But when they came time to do Superman 2, he was given this job of basically taking John Williams' music and rearranging it for Superman 2. So it's basically, the music is by John Williams, but the sort of cutting and splicing of it into different places in the movie was Ken Thorne. And also he had a reduced orchestra, because John Williams had the wonderful London Symphony Orchestra. The one used for Superman 2 was much smaller, so the sound of the music was just much less impressive, like a little too undercooked, I think. And that carries over into Superman 3. At that point, he was not using necessarily all of John Williams' music, but Ken Thorne was, again, basically told to use John Williams' themes, and he just repeats a lot of the same music that was in the first film, just now completely in different places. Like things that were the Krypton theme in Superman the movie are now used to score action sequences. I don't think it's Ken Thorne's fault. I think that's what he was told to do. I think it's a very hard way to, because ideally a score should be composed for the film, not sort of pasted onto a film, which I think is what it was. And again, they had a smaller orchestra. I think he did the best job he could, but the music's pretty unimpressive. And they did, Giorgio Moroder was a big deal at that time because of disco and the success of the Flashdance music and Call Me from American Gigolo, the Blondie song. So he was contracted to do a bunch of songs for the movie. The funny thing is they get a lot of credit, and they were all over the soundtrack album. They're barely heard in the film, if they're even heard at all.
Yeah, I remember there's one blaring from a car, I think, when Richard Pryor gets out of the car, you can hear one of the songs.
Yes.
I think that's the only one I recall hearing.
Yeah,
And
there's in the background of a few other things, but nothing you'd ever notice.
yeah,
You know?
and there's even the bizarre inclusion of Roger Miller on one of those songs,
Yeah.
which I thought was really reading that soundtrack album. I was like, Roger Miller in a Superman movie? I don't know. Even then, I thought it was strange way back when, but.
That's when you were entering that period, that weird period where they were putting, like, soundtrack albums were becoming sort of pop compilations instead of the actual score.
Yes.
I don't actually know how much of the score is on the album for Superman 3. I know a lot of those songs are there, though.
Yeah. Thankfully, for anybody who is curious, there is a box set that contains the complete scores for all 4 films. I don't know if it's still in print, but you can get that, and that's one of the bright spots of the 4th film is the Alexander Courage score, because obviously he did Star Trek and the Waltons and many other things, and he kind of reorchestrates the John Williams stuff, but I think it does an adequate job for number 4, so it was good to it's good to have all of those in one place, as it were. We will talk about the marketing right quick. So William Kotzwinkle, who was no stranger to novelizations, having penned a sequel to E.T., among many other things.
And the original novelization.
And exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. He penned the novelization to Superman 3.
And famously, it's the only novelization from the Superman series. There are novels that came out for Superman 1, which was, I believe, called The Last Son of Krypton. And then Superman 2, there was a novel called Miracle Monday. But they are not novelizations of the films, even though they include pictures from the films in them. And the reason for that was that Mario Puzo had retained the story publication rights to his screenplays. And so basically he either had to write the novelizations himself, which he did not do, or they had to pay him to allow novelizations to be written, which they did not want to do. So there are no novelizations for Superman 1 or 2, even though you can find things that look like novelizations. Kotzwinkle was the first guy who actually novelized the film as it existed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I would be interested in reading that. I would like to actually see if I could pick up a copy. I would just be curious because they say there are some nasty undertones in the book, that in his attempts to novelize the screenplay. And I think one of the reviews was something along the lines of, adults may enjoy the novel on its own merits as a black comedy of sorts, but it's not written for kids, and most of the under 15 crowd will either be puzzled or revolted by Kotzwinkle's dour humor. So,
that's interesting. I read it years ago. I don't really remember, but now you've got me curious. I need to go find a copy.
Yeah, I've got to do the same. So, yeah. And I totally
It
forgot.
Also, the book cover is the poster of the movie, and as sort of goofy as the movie is, it's a great poster. It
is. Yeah. It's Superman with Richard Pryor, where he's flying him about. Yeah, it's good art. You're right about that. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll talk about the television edition before we finish up here. Of course, we alluded to it earlier. A separate extended edition was produced, aired on ABC. Opening credits were in outer space, featuring an edited version of the film's end-credit theme music, serving as the opening theme. And
that was when the film came out. You had alluded earlier to the slapstick opening, and the credits play over that slapstick opening in a very weird type font, which is actually quite hard to read for some reason. And I guess when they put it on ABC, people were like, we want the Starfield titles back. So they just created this whole new sequence using the same lettering, unfortunately. But yeah, they gave it an opening to make it seem more like Superman 1 and Superman 2.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never knew the reasons behind that, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, people. That was one of the things, because people love those original titles for those first 2 films, and I don't think anybody loved the titles for Superman 3.
Yeah, so. I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah. And then they put a number of things back into the film. I know Richard Lester had a concern that they put way too much of the footage of Richard Pryor back in. the, not necessarily new scenes in particular, but just extending the existed ones. And of course, comedy, even if you don't care for the comedy in Superman 3, is all about timing. And by adding in all these extra bits and pieces, whatever timing there was pretty much shot, So I know Richard Lester was not happy with the TV cut.
I can imagine. Yeah, when it comes to a movie of this nature, timing is very important. That's exactly right.
He had even felt that because he had cut his director's cut of the film before it was theatrically released. He had felt he had cut back Richard Pryor so that it worked better, and Warner Brothers and the Salkind said, no, put more Richard Pryor back in, and he felt that there was probably too much of the jokiness in the theatrical cut. And then when they doubled it in the TV version, I think I don't know if he was beside himself, because I don't know how much he cared, but I know he didn't approve of it.
Yeah. It's there's most of these deleted scenes, of course, on the deluxe edition of Superman 3, which was released on DVD and Blu-ray, and it includes most of these scenes there. And there have been some fan edits that put all this back in.
Yes,
in place.
There are lots of fan edits.
Whether you want it or not,
yeah.
There are. And I'm just constantly amazed at how many people really, really, really want that extended cut of Superman 4. They're constantly, the guy who runs the Warner Archive, George Feltenstein, is constantly, I hear him on podcast, and he's constantly having to field questions about what state what state is that in? Are we going to get it? And he basically says that it exists, but it's going to have to take a lot of work to get it into shape, and Warner Brothers would have to actually pony up the money for that.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that's going to happen or not. But
I'm always fascinated in that too, because I think there's an idea that somehow if they put all that footage
it's going to salvage
in, it'll be a better movie. And my brother actually had the best quote. He goes, "Well, there'll certainly be more of it." He goes, whether it'll be any good or not is highly unlikely, I don't think. I mean, I've seen most of the cut scenes from Superman 4. It's the same problem as the rest of Superman 4. So,
yes.
But, people like to dream, so it's okay.
Yes. We had the writer of Superman 4 on our podcast years ago. I think it was maybe for the 30th anniversary, and he basically explained exactly what went wrong. Based on his original what he had originally written versus what came out of the film, and I
actually read that script back around the time right before the movie came out, and I don't have it around. It's somewhere in storage, and I got to pull out because I remember it was really good.
Yeah.
But it was really good, requiring a proper budget and a proper director, and they just went for cheesy and low budget. But I remember reading it and thinking, wow, this is a big improvement over Superman 3. And then the movie came out and it was sort of gobsmacking how awful it was.
I think his heart sank when he saw it, but that's a whole other story.
No, I think because he and his partner, they wrote some decent films in that era, and they're good writers. So I can imagine. I've never spoken to him about it, but I'm sure he was heartbroken.
Yes.
And the thing, circling back to Superman 3, I do want to say, it doesn't have. I don't think it's nearly as a good a movie at all as the first two. And if someone had a great quote, it's not mine, but they said about the Superman movies is each succeeding Superman movie is half as good as the preceding Superman movie. So I think Superman 2 is a bit of a letdown from Superman, and I think Superman 3 is a letdown from Superman 2, and then of course Superman 4. But I do want to say there are good things in the movie, and I think we should highlight that. I think overall it doesn't work. It is too silly and just too lazy and unfocused in its storytelling. But Annette O'Toole is terrific in the movie. I also think when he's given moments, Richard Pryor, he has a couple of serious moments in the movie, and I think they're really effective. There's one moment where the Robert Vaughn, the villain, is talking about, doing something to accumulate more money. And Richard Pryor just quietly goes, "But you have so much already." and it's really effective.
Yeah, it is.
And there's a moment in the end where they're basically killing Superman, and Robert Vaughn says something like, "You're going to go down in history as the man who killed Superman," and Pryor very quietly goes, "No," and it works. And even the bit at the end when they're in the coal pit and Superman, suggests he get a job, he says, "Thanks a lot, man." And it's very, Richard Pryor could be very real when he wanted to be. And I think he has some really nice moments in the film that are not necessarily comedic. I don't know if the comedy works. I think it's all a little too broad and silly, but the real moments work very well. And the other thing that gets overlooked a little bit is Christopher Reeve was very, obviously applauded for what a wonderful job he did in the first two pictures of essentially playing two different characters. He played Clark Kent, obviously, in Superman. What's kind of interesting in Superman 3 is he plays four characters. He plays Superman. He plays Clark Kent as we know him. He also plays a quieter version of Clark Kent. When he's with Lana Lang, he's much less silly. Like even in Superman 1 and 2, his Clark is a very screwball comedy type character. And in Superman 3, when he's with Lana, he's not slapsticky. He's a little quieter, a little more real. And there's a really lovely moment between the two of them in the hotel at the end where he's playing him as a really real person. And I think that's very it doesn't get a lot of attention, but I think he's really impressive. And then of course he plays the Superman gone bad. And even though they don't give him much to do, he delineates a separate character. So, kudos to that man in those films,
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Yeah, it's you can always find something good if you look hard enough, and that Superman 3 is no exception. It did gross $60 million. It was the 12th biggest grossing film of 1983 in North America, and we will say that it had its world premiere at the Uptown Theater in Washington, D.C. on June 12th of 83, and then had its New York premiere on June the 14th of 1983 at Cinema One, and released in theaters June 17th of 83. Yes. And it holds a 30% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, or a rating of 4.6 out of 10 on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 56 reviews. Leonard Maltin said that it was an appalling sequel that trashed everything Superman was about for the sake of cheap laughs and a co-starring role for Richard Pryor. The film was nominated for 2 Razzie Awards, including Worst Supporting Actor for Richard Pryor and Worst Musical Score for Giorgio Moroder.
There you go.
So, yeah. Anyway.
I do have a good personal story connected with the film, though. The occasion of its release in New York was the one time I got to meet Richard Lester, which was very cool. Because the Museum of Modern Art, in celebration of the film opening, did a one-day retrospective of Richard Lester films. So I remember they showed Petulia and Robin and Marion and The Knack and How to Get It. And I went with a friend of mine, and we spent all day in the theater watching these films, which at that time I had not seen because, the pre-video days, they had come out before I was a regular moviegoer. And we really enjoyed it. And at the end of the day, Richard Lester came in and said a few words to the audience, dressed in his tux, because he was heading uptown to the New York premiere of Superman 3. And so he gave a little bit of a talk. And on his way out, I got to shake his hand and say hello, and that I was a fan of his work. And he was very nice and he didn't stop. He kept moving because he had to go to the premiere. But I'm a huge Richard Lester fan. I'm not a huge Richard Lester Superman fan. But so that was a nice treat for me on the occasion of that film opening. Doesn't have anything to do with the quality of the movie, though. So.